Good morning. My name's Ed Fuller. I'm here with my colleague, DeMarcus Jenkins. We're from Penn State University, and welcome to the Mitstifer lecture. This is sponsored by Penn State through the generous donation of Robert Mitstifer and his wife, Dorothy Mitstifer, both of whom were graduates from the Educational Leadership Program at Penn State University. We've been funding this lecture for over the last 15 years, and we're really excited to have this year's speaker, as we are with every speaker. And I'll let my great colleague, DeMarcus Jenkins, introduce him.
Good morning. I have the great honor of introducing our Mitstifer lecture speaker today, Dr. Bruce Baker. Bruce Baker is a professor in the Department of Education, Theory, Policy, and Administration at the Rutgers University Graduate School of Education, and is widely recognized as a leading scholar in the field of education finance. His recent research focuses on state aid allocation policies and practices, with particular attention to the equity and adequacy of aid for special student populations. He is a past recipient of an NCES AEFA New Scholars Award and has received research funding from the Association for Institutional Research for studying variations in cost to bachelor's degree attainment. Please join me as we welcome our speaker for today. Get up here.
Are you ready for some school finance? Can I hear it a little more? Are we ready for some school finance here? All right, school finance, it's time. First of all, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. A little overwhelmed by the invite. I haven't been back to UCA in a little while, and that's on me. This is actually one of those conferences that really gave me, for the younger scholars out there who are trying to figure out the lay of the land, the conferences, where to go, what to do where. This is the setting that really supports your opportunity to do creative, different, and interesting things among a very accepting group and supportive group of scholars. This is a great place for that. This is where I was able to introduce some of my more ridiculous and crazy ideas on school finance to audiences that were very open to that. It's great to have Ed start us off today. I've known Ed for a number of years. I want to just thank UCA for inviting me for this, and quickly thank a couple other people, because I also would not be here if it weren't for people like Terry Orr, who passed me in the class that I was probably worse at in my graduate program at Teachers College, organizational theory, and helped me and my usual co-conspirator, Preston Green, figure out how it is that we can kind of build a research agenda that gets external recognition. In a lengthy conversation we had one day at the top of an escalator at a UCA convention. So great stuff happens in this space. Take advantage of that. Have fun with it, and run with it. So with that, let's dive into some school finance. Going to grab my clicker here. I'm going to try to stand in place. So I tend to move around a lot. Now, I'm going to hit 3 topics today. The first is about measuring school finance. And I've been really working on trying to reshape the field in the measurement of school finance, both from a practical perspective and a theoretical perspective, because of the way information has become more available, and because of the legal framings that have come about for arguing for more equitable and adequate school funding for in the states. Pennsylvania just going to trial, and I think Ed's going to be taking the stand in the next few weeks in the Pennsylvania trial on equitable and adequate school funding. So I'm going to talk about measuring school finance, linking conceptual framing to empirical models, which ties in with a major national data set that we've developed. And I'm going to talk about some of the findings from those analyses. And we're also going to dig into some of the causes of the disparities, the inequities and inadequacies of funding that exist, a lot of which ties into this second point, that these racial disparities that I had noticed emerging in so many of my earlier analyses that appeared to me, at least from the outset, to be some kind of a correlate associated with race. It took a while for me on this, but I've come to realize, in fact, the underlying cause of the vast majority of these disparities is racism itself. that it is racism that has caused the disparities that exist in the accumulated wealth in housing and in the way that property taxes play off of that, and many other features that tie in with the inequities in school funding that exist today. And that racism is racism embedded in policies from the first half of the 20th century and in practices that persist to this day. I could say, I think with pretty good confidence, that if a David Martin goes looking for a house somewhere in Connecticut, he's going to be shown a very different set of houses or apartments to rent than a David Martinez. And those are the practices that persist up to today in steering populations into certain locations that reinforce the disparities that we had built into policy in the first half of the 20th century. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that second. And then I want to introduce people who haven't been aware of this to the School Finance Indicators database, massive database from 1993 to 2019 of state level indicators of school funding inequity and inadequacy and a number of other economic features of states. And we also have a district level panel of 13,000 districts per year throughout that same stretch of time that we can make available to researchers, which, and we also have a number of interactive tools that are available for policymakers. So I'm going to talk about the School Finance Indicators database, time permitting. I'm talking quickly because I'm trying to get into some stuff here. First, we got to kick through some basic school finance facts. One of the first ones is, if we look at school funding over time adjusted for changes in labor costs, as opposed to just nominally, using two different adjustments here, we see that either by our original adjustment, school funding expenditures per pupil had rebounded from the Great Recession by 2019, but it took that whole decade for those to rebound. Our other version of the labor cost index has those rebounding by 2015 over 2008 levels. But overall, we've not seen massive growth over time in public school expenditures per pupil, as some would have you believe. Also, actually go back to that one just for a second. That means that our public school expenditures per pupil are back to the point when Boom Boom Pow was a top hit and Taylor Swift was an up and coming artist. The proportion of our economic capacity spent on schools is at really a low that hasn't been seen since Top Gun was tops at the box office. It's kind of leveled out, and we don't really want to compare the percent of economic capacity now to what happened right at the moment of the Great Recession, because that's when the denominator, the aggregate income, dipped. So the percent of public expenditure, the percent of aggregate income that was spent on schools spiked up to 4.8%. But the equilibrium prior to the Great Recession was at about 4.4 to 4.5%. The equilibrium from the 90s through the early 2000s was 4.2% of economic capacity. We've dipped down to about 3.8 to 3.9%. And we've not recovered. We're spending less of our economic capacity on schools. And that is reflected, we'll see later on, in how much we spend and how equitably we spend on schools. We haven't seen a huge, there are all these articles that were written by conservative groups about the staffing surge, that we've just thrown more and more people into schools. We've actually finally rebounded in 2020 with the number of teachers per 100 pupils. We've had a slow upward drift in support staff. It's interesting, in a lot of cases, we've seen increases in support staff and additional staff assigned to classrooms because we didn't yet have the infrastructure. We didn't build the additional classrooms needed to actually have it smaller class sizes and more teachers. That happened with the addition of funds in New Jersey from 1998 to 2005, following the Abbott court rulings. We've had some upward drift support staff. We are kind of back to slightly above where we were in 2009 on teachers per 100 pupils, and administrative costs and all that, not eating up the whole budget. Teacher salaries as a share of similarly educated non-teachers with the same degree levels have continued to decline over time. So we've managed to keep a little steady on the quantities of teachers per pupil, but the wages of teachers relative to similarly educated and same age and some other analyses I have individuals are continuing to backslide, and were at their best in the early 1990s. We do have some upward drift in school administrative costs per pupil, district administrative costs relatively flat over time, but both are a tiny share of the overall puzzle. Benefits costs have increased, wages have increased slightly per pupil, but we, again, we don't have these massive increases, nor do we have these spikes at particular points in time. The benefits have definitely been a pressure that the school district administrators have felt, and boards of ed in their budgeting. So, one of the things that's often put out there, and this is, I'll post these slides on my website. Maybe there's another way we can share these with UCEA. But I want to make a lot of the information in these slides available so that you yourselves can just kind of grab it and use it. There's the graph on the right. This is when Betsy DeVos used it. Bill Gates has used it. A number of other people have different versions of this graph to argue spending went up and up, test scores stayed flat. Even if you do something as simple as what Kirabo Jackson did in the analysis on the left, zoom in and rescale these, we see that as spending went up, the test scores were going up. As spending flattened and dipped, the test scores flattened and dipped. Certainly that's not a rigorous causal statistical analysis. Bo did that in 3 or 4 other related articles to show that the increases in spending when they occurred did lead to substantive changes in short and long run student outcomes, and that the recessionary cuts caused harm. And to layer onto that, if David Knight's in the room, who does some awesome work in school finance, recessionary cuts fell very disparately by the poverty and economic status of the school districts and children they serve. Higher poverty districts serving needier populations and with less capacity of their own, got hit hardest in that recession. Evaluating school finance systems. Now, this is where I really want to start to shift the thinking. And we wrote about this, Preston Green and I wrote about this in 2008, that the primary goal of state school finance systems, what we're trying to accomplish is providing equal opportunity to achieve common outcome goals. This framing alone can replace kind of the old school language that we may be using and hearing in our school finance classes about horizontal and vertical equity. And it's important that we replace that language for purposes of making legal arguments and claims, because horizontal equity speaks to this equal treatment of equals, and vertical equity, this unequal treatment of unequals. And that actually voids your possibility of making an argument for equal protection of students on the basis of different needs, because equal protection pertains to those who are similarly situated. If they're not similarly situated, if they're unequals, they don't fall under that framework. But if we assume the treatment to be the goal, that all children should have access to common outcome goals and equal opportunity to get there, then all children are similarly situated with respect to that treatment. And it requires that we provide different levels of resources in different settings for different children. It's also the case that state accountability systems, for what they're worth, expect everyone to get to certain common outcomes, from No Child Left Behind forward, actually, to the precursors of that in state models in Texas and elsewhere. We put the cart before the horse. We said, we said the outcomes are inequitable. We want everyone to get to equitable outcomes. We're going to start measuring them in these ways. And you're going to get there, or we're going to call you a bad school or a bad teacher. We'd never asked at the time, we did not calibrate school finance systems at the time to address the different costs to provide equal opportunity to get to those goals. Later, when we got to 2011, Race to the Top era and the new normal under Arne Duncan and President Obama, we started hearing economists talk about, well, the schools that have fewer resources and aren't getting to the outcomes just have to play Moneyball. Like the book and then movie about the Oakland A's. Anyone know the subtitle of the book, Moneyball? It's the art of winning an unfair game. Baseball, fine, that can be an unfair game. This should not. So we have to think about how to recalibrate state school finance systems, or even a national school finance system that provides the levels of resources that are calibrated for everyone to have equal opportunity to achieve common outcomes. And we'll take a look at how that works and how that actually plays out across districts and states in a little bit here. So in this, we've come up with, I've been working with my doc student, Mark Weber, who's a wonderful jazz pianist and has decided to remain a middle school music teacher while doing all this amazing quant work on school finance. So I got Mark Weber and Matt DiCarlo at the Shanker Institute. We've reshaped this indicator system to really focus. We got it down to 3, but now I'm really most interested in 2 things in our indicator system. Effort, which is how much of each, how much of its economic capacity does each state put up? Is each state willing to put up to support public schools? And then the other one that's critically important is relative adequacy or equal opportunity. If we're able to come up with an estimate of what it would cost in each district, in each school, to get the children in that setting to a common outcome goal and compare that to what they currently have, we can look at that as either a gap or a ratio to say, well, how much more or less does every district need to provide the kids in their, under their watch, equal opportunity to achieve common outcome goals? That relative adequacy measure has evolved as kind of a new opportunity in the presence of new data. We have our fiscal panel of data, which goes from 1993 to 2019, with all sorts of economic and financial and student demographic measures on school districts. And we're able to link that with the Stanford Education Data Archive outcome measures, where Sean Reardon and company have normalized state assessment outcome data to a common scale, and actually now estimate what's the cost in every district in the country to achieve any particular common outcome goal, and how far are the different districts from it. And we put that out in this report and as a downloadable data set for every district. And it's also documented because, we're in academia, you got to put a version of it in a journal somewhere. The lead article in the Journal of Ed Finance is because of publication lag, is a 2-year older version of the same model. This is, I think, where we need to go more and more. We used to look more just at how much does spending vary with respect to different factors. Is it progressive or regressive? We've really moved to the model on the right, which incorporates the outcomes. Because as Bill Duncombe, who my first book is dedicated to, who passed a few years ago, said in a 1999 article, education costs and outcomes, you can't have one without the other. You have to estimate your costs with respect to an outcome goal, especially when we're expecting all students to strive for and achieve these common outcome goals, be it college readiness or whatever. And admittedly, we got to do a heck of a lot better on measuring those outcomes, the breadth and depth of the real and important outcomes, but we have to consider the outcomes in determining the costs. And we're able to also include in these models corrections for which districts might be spending more or less efficiently. But we've moved to the model on the right to focus much more on equal opportunity to achieve common goals, and less just looking at, and there are other reports out there that just look at, is the funding upward tilted with respect to poverty? Is it flat with respect to poverty or downward? These are still useful frameworks. And it's implied that the funding should at the very least be upward tilted with respect to poverty. What this framework doesn't get you to is, well, is the level high enough and is the tilt strong enough? Right. And those are those big next level questions that we want to be able to get to. Well, is the level high enough to achieve an adequate outcome? And is the tilt strong enough so that the kids in the highest poverty districts have equal opportunity to the kids in the lowest poverty districts to achieve the adequate outcome? And as long as you're not Utah, Andrea in the room? Okay. Okay, so here's some results in our, well, I could have put a couple other states up there too. Arizona, except that would have been low and downward tilting. So yeah, and that's the thing, when I do these talks for like AASA or advocacy groups, and you got people from different groups that want to kind of gripe about their state school finance system, that's where everyone wants to be able to say we're last. We've got the worst school finance system. And I always have to point out that unless you're Arizona, it's probably not you, but you might be down there with them. There are a lot of states that are making a run for it. This is on effort. I mean, look, Florida's chasing Arizona hard on the proportion of their economic capacity spent on schools over time. The really interesting thing to us is how this blew up during the Great Recession, right? It just scattered. Some states just decided that the recession gave them opportunity to cut, and that as the economy rebounded, let's keep at it. North Carolina, Florida, Arizona, Tennessee. Let's just keep cutting. Why not? As the economy rebounds, why should we spend on schools? Some states, on the other hand, did kind of, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, on average rebounded, but they didn't necessarily get the money back into their districts that had high needs. Wealthy suburban districts in those states rebounded, but they left behind a number of the higher poverty, higher need districts. This had consequences for revenues, state and local revenues in the highest poverty districts. It took a hit at the Great Recession, kind of leveled off, and some states decided to climb back out of that. And other states like Arizona decided, why bother? And Oklahoma is right down there with them too. So we've really seen a massive kind of new burst of inequality across states since the Great Recession. And we've also seen that inequality blow up within states because there's been much less effort on retargeting any additional money that's gone in, or just the money that's there, to the districts with the greatest needs. One thing that we find in some models, I've been working with a political scientist from Haverford College, Zach Oberfeld, really neat guy, fun to work with. One thing we find in a series of regression models is that one of the strongest, it's like a preview of the implicit, if not explicit, racism baked into school funding. In these regression models, we find that one of the strongest predictors of declining funding is this gap between the race of the student population to be served and the adult voter population. Older white people don't like to vote to fund schools for increasingly Black and brown kids. It's a finding that's existed in public econ research for decades. It's a finding that we had this whole theory about these political liberalism and other policy disposition variables driving school funding choices in states, submitted some journal articles, and every reviewer came back and said, you guys buried the lead, you got the wrong finding. Your big finding here is that the race gap is really one of the strongest drivers of the choice or not at the state level or at the local level to spend more on schools. When we leave it up to, legislative deliberation, which it must be at the state level, or local voter control. So adequacy and outcomes. Now we jump to the maps. This is, on the left, a map where we just set the outcome goal to the national average outcomes based on the outcome data for reading and math, grades 3 through 8, because that's what we do. That's what's tended to be available from the Stanford Education Data Archive. We estimate the cost per pupil for every district in the country with a two-stage least squares cost model with indirect controls for inefficiency, for all, that's my little disclaimer notes for the school finance people in the room. And we have a cost prediction for what it would take in every district to achieve national average outcomes. And then in the map on the left, we have kind of in shades of red to blue, how much under or over that cost prediction are districts. And we've got districts throughout the Deep South, and in particular through the Black Belt of the Deep South, that have $10,000, $20,000 per pupil less than they would need to achieve national average outcomes. And that's a pretty low bar, actually, national average outcomes anchored back. The bridge in the Stanford Education Data Archive data is through the NAEP data. So, for those who wish to decry our national aggregate scores on international assessments in comparison to Finland or other countries or Singapore, our national average is relatively low. It is what it is in part because we've allowed large numbers of states to throw their education systems under the bus. Many of these systems actually are among those that are just putting up low effort. Some of them are low capacity. We'll see in a few slides, what's the relationship between effort and adequacy, and it's actually pretty strong. We also see that the map on the left that shows the funding gaps, the over-unders, because we set the goal to the cost of achieving national average outcomes, they're about half over, about half under. The outcomes correlate pretty strongly if you jump over to the map on the right, which is straight from the Stanford Education Data Archives maps. And if we look at this in scatter plots and we pull out different states, we see that, on average, there's a pattern where more adequate funding is associated with more adequate outcomes. Now, the model isn't perfect yet. There's a lot more. We got to try to figure out how to get it in there. Maybe that'll clean up the pattern even more. But we also see that states like New Jersey and Connecticut are mostly, the school districts in New Jersey and Connecticut are mostly in the upper right, where they spend enough or more than enough to achieve national average outcomes, and they exceed those outcomes. Now, Connecticut leaves more districts behind, the red, kind of the maroon diamonds. There are more Connecticut districts left behind in the lower left corner, in part because Connecticut has had less aggressive effort to provide more equitable funding, and Connecticut has had even more severe patterns of continued racial residential segregation and substantial disadvantage, in particular of Latinx districts, which ends up being an emerging theme in a lot of this. And if we look at Arizona and Texas, we actually see that the vast majority of districts are in the lower left-hand corner. Not enough funding to achieve national average outcomes and not achieving those outcomes. We do have some scatter around that. We can talk about the upper left and lower right quadrant all you want after this, but on average, the patterns hold, they hold pretty well. Here's another point that I think I shouldn't always have to make, but seem to, is that if we raise the outcome bar, if we shoot for Massachusetts average outcomes, more people are below it and further below it because it costs more to achieve higher outcomes than lower ones. It's another thing that we've done to schools and districts, in addition to saying you're going to achieve these common outcomes, even though we haven't recalibrated your funding to give you equal opportunity to, and we're going to call you bad if you don't, whether we gave you the funding to get there or not. We've also, in many states, raised the standards without ever considering, well, what would the cost be to getting even the same number of kids to those new higher standards? Because doing more, whether it's increasing the breadth of the standards or increasing the rigor and level of the standards, it costs more to achieve more or higher outcomes. And that's something that just needs to be ingrained in the minds of state policymakers. And we can, go state to state and look at specific examples. We also see, if we boil it down to the city level data here, that cities that have more adequate funding over time from 2009 to 18, cities like Manchester, New Hampshire, or Boston, or even New York. Now the outcome data end at 2013. That's why it just flatlines as the New York funding scales up. Cities with better funding, more adequate funding relative to their costs, have had more adequate outcomes. The interesting one, because we always hear these stories of the DC miracle, DC's NAEP trial urban district assessment scores going up. One of the things that happened that people don't talk about as much is the relative adequacy of funding in DC has gone up. And it is tracked pretty cleanly with the growth in scores, which should at the very least be added to claims that it was about adopting new teacher evaluation systems or expanding charter schooling. Either of which, any of these things, running schools as they are or running schools in the presence of new reforms and changes, is easier to do better when you have the resources to get it done. What we see as a national average pattern is that higher poverty districts are rarely, likely to have sufficient funds to achieve even national average outcomes. It's a very strong, kind of persistent pattern across the country. And it's because most state school finance systems are not even close to progressive. At best, the best state school finance systems these days have roughly the same amount of funding for people in the highest poverty as they do in the lowest poverty districts. We also see that states that try harder do better. States that put up a larger share of their economic capacity to fund schools have more adequate funding in their highest poverty districts. States like Florida, North Carolina, and Arizona don't do so well. They don't put up much effort. They don't raise adequate funding for their highest poverty districts. There are states, though, just like we have richer and poorer districts within states that have different capacity to raise funding on their own. Mississippi, New Mexico, Alabama, those are states that put up relatively average effort and simply lack the capacity to raise adequate funding. And that's where a redesigned federal school finance model could really have significant effects. That we could, and I've been working and talking with committees on Title I funding, looking at the scaling up of federal funding and how we can account for, how we can put pressure on states to increase their effort, and how we can account for those states that simply lack capacity, the same way we do in state school finance formulas. We also find, we find that effort is, in our statistical models, effort's a driver of adequacy. That should come as no surprise. Racial disparities. So this leads us to some of these racial disparities. And one thing that we found, this goes back to, a finding I used to do, it started as a blog post. After I was doing those progressiveness, regressiveness slopes, I started to realize there were some districts that always fell off the line, that were severely underfunded relative to everyone else around them. And I did first the blog post was called America's Most Screwed School Districts. I did a report for Center for American Progress where screwed became translated to financially disadvantaged. And buried in that 2014 report, and I'm kind of bummed that I buried it until 2021, was the finding that one of the strongest predictors of being a financially disadvantaged district was the proportion of Latinx students in the district. And in particular, majority Latinx districts were most likely to be disadvantaged. What we found in our national sweep of these data is that this runs at two levels. States where the majority of kids in schools are Latinx, Texas, Arizona, are the states that have driven school funding into the ground. But then within the better funded states, even New Jersey or New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York, it's the predominantly Latinx second cities that are always getting the shaft. It's not, we don't see, it's not always the major cities. It's not Boston getting the shaft in Massachusetts. It's Lowell, Lawrence, New Bedford, Holyoke. It's not in Connecticut. It's not as much Hartford, New Haven. It's Waterbury, New Britain, Danbury, New London. You know, places that, you know, if you're not from Connecticut, you may not have heard of these places. In Illinois, Chicago does not get well funded, but Waukegan gets less well funded, and so does Aurora East. And in Pennsylvania, yeah, Philadelphia is the least well-funded major urban district in the country, but Allentown and Reading and Lebanon and other places that have predominantly Latino populations are significantly less well-funded. Even in New Jersey, it's Dover, Bound Brook, you know, places that we don't, Perth Amboy, not Newark, Camden, and Jersey City that are the least well-funded in the state. So this is a persistent problem. Rob Cotto, who's a doc student at UConn with Preston Green, and I have been trying to unpack this a little more over time and try to figure what, you know, what's up with that, if we could get a Saturday Night Live segment on it. There's some of the cause, so this jumps us right into the racial disparity stuff, which I'm going to try to crank through at a couple of levels here. Racial disparities arise from racial causes, and really the first book, I have my students read Color of Law now, which of course walks through kind of the federal policy pieces of the puzzle around the FHA and Homeowners Loan Corporation, the redlining maps. My first introduction to this came when I was in Kansas City, and an author, a sociologist, graduate from KU, Kevin Fox Gotham, wrote a book, Race, Real Estate, and Uneven Development, that talked much more about the use of racially restrictive covenants through private homeowners associations that were kind of established by realtors. And all this stuff links up in ways that I definitely don't have time to dig into deep right here and now. But these layers, the HOLC redlining maps, which really there's a cool new NBER paper out that shows that the zones that were redlined assigned as being higher risk, lower value spaces for obtaining loans, that really just codified what had been going on with FHA loans leading up to HOLC. So blame FHA, not HOLC, but let's just blame them both. Because collectively, these strategies capitalized on the single simple point that racism sells. Whiteness sells houses for higher prices, blackness for lower prices, and that persists into the practices of the real estate industry today through steering for rental and owned properties, and mortgage lending discrimination simply based on blind audits of having a Black or Latino sounding name on the application versus having a white sounding name, which is why I made the point. And the steering and the rental steering occurs around the Northeast. There were some interesting recent pieces on that. Again, based on the last name alone, which is why I made the comment that David Martin would be shown different neighborhoods than David Martinez. David, you in the room? Anyway, so this has led to over time depressed wealth accumulation and lower incomes, depressed taxable housing, wealth and school revenue, race and poverty isolation of schools, which actually feeds back into our cost models. If we start including racial isolation among the cost factors, we see that the cost estimates for these spaces on which racial isolation and poverty at an intersection that is different, measurably has additional costs to overcome the outcome barriers. So, and then there's this last piece, this racism in voter behavior, which I originally had kind of described as an implicit racism in voting for additional funding for school, but I think a lot of that's just as explicit as the rest of this. Redlining maps. So this is just kind of a picture walking through the biases of state and local voters that, you know, old white people don't like to fund schools for Black and brown kids. And the more the population changes to become increasingly, and it's usually increasingly Latino, the funding goes down. Back to these causes, Preston Green and I wrote a couple of pieces, one in the Washington Lee Law Review and one in The Conversation, outlining what we called a 4-part reparations plan, that we have these racial causes that are, some are still ongoing. That's important here. And others are still things that happen to people who are still alive today. This is not the same. It's a separate conversation from reparations in relation directly to slavery, which also really isn't that long ago. But this is a conversation that affects, you know, people who were alive today, maybe only one generation away from it. And because the cause was racism, we need to address race directly in the solutions. We can't avoid it. You can't solve it without addressing race directly. Damage is done, racial disparities in home values, racial disparities in school district revenues, adverse effects on student outcomes due to racial isolation. And there's still embedded racism in state school finance formulas. I'll throw you an example in a couple minutes. Preston and I lay out in our paper some of kind of the empirical work that, you know, in communities that are predominantly Black and the housing values depressed. We did this actually by the Black versus white ownership of the actual houses. The housing values are depressed, and to try to make up the revenue, the Black homeowners are paying a higher tax rate than the white homeowners. And even with that Black tax added on, which is, you know, $1,000 to $2,000 a year in many of these cases, they still aren't able to generate equitable revenue, and state school finance formulas aren't fully covering the difference either. So the first two pieces we threw into our, what we called at the time, a reparations framework, were rebates for the Black tax margin, give back to Black homeowners that additional portion that they're paying in the higher tax rate on their homes, but then also supplement the state aid to cover the remaining margin that's associated with the Black-white gap. And we see, you know, even if we just kind of go maps, and people who follow my Twitter feed see a lot of these maps that I'm playing with as I go. You know, if we look at just using as one kind of guide here, if we look at those HOLC redlining maps from 1939, and we overlay those with the funding gaps from our models that I showed you a few minutes ago, we see that the areas that had redline spaces in the first half of the 20th century are the areas that all these years later have the least adequate funding in 2018. And, you know, we can dig in. There's going to be a lengthy kind of qual historical type report where we do some stories behind some of these spaces. One of the fun ones I thought I'd bring in here is like, you know, in Columbus, we got that Bexley city that's carved right out of it. That was nice little A and B class neighborhoods back in 1939. A lot of Columbus City was C and D class, low rated spaces. You know, Upper Arlington was also had some A and B spaces, but then outlying spaces. If we plot those on our scatter plots from our school finance indicator system, you know, to this day, Bexley City has more than enough funding for its schools to achieve national average outcomes, and achieves more than national average outcome. And Columbus City is at the other end, and one is carved right out of the other. We have so many spaces like that across the country where the boundaries that have been established have really reinforced and built on these disparities. So Preston and I laid out a 4-part framework, these tax rebates to homeowners, filling the gap on the school district revenues. The big one is that we also have to include back in those cost models, racial isolation, to determine how much more does it cost when we've created an impoverished, racially isolated district like Ferguson, Missouri, or Irvington, New Jersey, And are those costs even higher than our original models that didn't include race would suggest? And that was work that I originally did back in around 2008 to 2011. And then there's all this thing we hope to have, OCR audit state school finance formulas for pieces that build on, obviously racist past. Kansas has an adjustment in its school funding formula for the districts, the 16 districts with the highest priced houses. And Kansas is kind of the focal point. The Kansas side suburbs are the focal point of the Kevin Fox Gotham book about how racially restrictive covenants were used actually to create those housing price differentials, which exist to today. You can trace it right back. So, and John, there's a great John Oliver segment. And I love this quote where he said, this is quantum, when we talk about reparations for this stuff, it's not like we're talking about something in some distant past that has no relation to who's here now. First of all, strong relation to what's going on here now. Second of all, it's quantifiable harm done in our lifetimes to people who are still alive. More detail for those who want to dig into the slides at another point in time. Racial isolation, I just want to show you, we could do the technical side. One, if I put race in the model cleans up. I'm going to do a fun, interesting statistical article that talks about this issue of, in the original cost models we ran, it would appear that districts that are majority Black are simply less efficient at producing outcomes. That would play right into a lot of the racially loaded language that we already hear about predominantly Black urban areas' ability to self-govern and run their own. It plays right into the talk about voters in places like Philadelphia and Chicago. And really it's an oversight of the model to not consider that we've actually hoisted upon these communities hard to understand additional costs of overcoming the educational outcome difference. It's the same reason we see in statistical analyses, even after we control for poverty and income factors in any number of ways, that there remain racial disparities in student outcomes. And in particular, those exist along Black-white lines. And a lot of that, I think, and I delve into some of the underlying reasons and causes in a 2011 article, but a lot of that, I think, specifically ties into, what are all of the special things, circumstances we have hoisted upon these communities that we forcibly made, poor and concentrated Black communities over the decades. And when we account for that in our models, one, it cleans up the residuals. Two, we get totally different cost estimates. If I try to estimate if I estimate the cost to get to national average outcomes in Baltimore without accounting for race, it's about $22,000 per pupil in 2023. If I account for the racial isolation of Baltimore schools to get to national average outcomes, the cost estimate goes to $27,500. If I try to get to Massachusetts average outcomes, if I don't consider racial isolation, the cost is $39,000 in 2023. But if I include the fact that Baltimore, much of Baltimore having been racially isolated by redlining, other portions by blockbusting, being the next report out, the cost jumps substantially. It's important, if we really want to provide equal opportunity to achieve common outcomes for kids in these settings, we need to look at the full costs, and we need to account for the racial isolation that we have actively and aggressively through policy and practices imposed on these communities over the decades. Last piece on the reparations is eliminating these funding formula features that capitalize on systemic racism. I mentioned this Kansas one. If we take a look in the Kansas City area, a bunch of districts, Blue Valley and Gardner, Edgerton, DeSoto, and Olathe, a bunch of districts in a county that was really originally developed as an escape for white families by J.C. Nichols, whose monuments just came down from the plaza in Kansas City about a year ago, when they started realizing the role he played in developing really a national model for racially discriminatory housing. The county, Johnson County, the one down to the lower level, all the districts out in that direction get this special adjustment for being districts with high-priced houses. The one in this space that doesn't is the district that was home to lots of redline spaces. Kansas City, Kansas. Everyone around him gets this, and the adjustment itself is built on the racist practices developed by J.C. Nichols and everyone who followed in his footsteps. We need to look at these policies. And actually, there are a number of policies across states. Actually, the structure of the STAR tax relief program in New York State, which has begun to kind of phase down, targets money based on tax bills, which are based on housing values, which are derivative of discriminatory housing policies. Texas had a similar tax relief structure in their formula. It was ASETR was the acronym. I can't remember what it stood for off the top of my head. So there are a lot of other policies. The Kansas one is kind of the most plain and obvious one, where it's just built on past systemic discrimination. I'll share the slide so you can look at the descriptors behind why these certain neighborhoods were redlined, but it'll be things like increasing presence of Negroes would be a factor in determining that a space would be a D-rated as opposed to a B-rated space. Preston and I did our original paper on this stuff back in 2003 at UCA, which became a piece in the American Journal of Ed. All right, yeah, and Kansas City finally taking down the statues. Now, just want to close out by introducing you. If you're not familiar with it, I'm hoping there's some kind of young scholars, some school finance folks in the room, or budding school finance folks in the room, or even those of you who want to use school finance data as a covariate. I'm willing to accept that, all I talk about is just stuff that's good covariates, right? That you want to know when you're looking at how well this program or that program is being implemented, or whether this program is having this effect or that, knowing the context of whether there was adequate funding to support that can matter. We have this schoolfinancedata.org. It's not a sales pitch because it's free and we're actually not really funded for it anymore, but it was started with funding from William T. Grant Foundation, generous support from Adam Gamaran to both develop the data sets and to help policymakers understand how to use them. We have a state level panel of indicators from 1993 to 2019 and a district level data set of a whole bunch of stuff that we're willing to share with researchers. And we also have a bunch of kind of visual tools and things that are handy, I think, for using in your classes to teach school finance and to understand the patterns of disparities that we see. We got state by state, and we do have a kind of an overview piece. Matt DiCarlo has been outstanding at putting the site and the explanatory pieces together. We have annual reports we put out. We also have state reports that summarize the indicators for each state. And we have data visualizations like the one that I showed for Bexley and Columbus, where you can download the district level data set of the predicted cost per pupil to achieve national average outcomes and the current expenditure and the gaps. You can get the whole country on that, and we'll keep updating that. But you can also do these data visualizations where you look up individual districts. Like these are two nearby districts, Clayton and Normandy, in Missouri. Yep, Missouri people in the room. And Clayton is an affluent suburban district that spends more than enough and achieves well above national average outcomes, by contrast with Normandy that falls way in the lower left. And I use these with my students to just assign them. I'll combine these with, using some of the EdBuild segregation maps and our maps. There's actually another site that mapped all of our data from this for individual searches, and just have students write up profiles of states or districts within states or adjacent districts to be able to kind of tease out these kinds of disparities. There are also some cool data sets you might want to try to combine this with. These HOLC redlining maps are available as a shapefile online. Stanford Education Data Archive, we already bring those outcomes in. There's a really cool data set through Michigan State, correlates of state policy, a panel of all of these factors like the political liberalness of states, the political balance of legislatures, the political the way in which courts are, the way in which judges are appointed, and so on. There's all sorts of cool stuff in there that makes for some fun kind of political analysis linked to our data. And then there's our data. Just to sum it up, money matters. I don't think anyone in this room is going to deny that or push back too hard against that. Yes, it matters how you use it. We always run into that when there are all these kind of things that are thrown at you. Well, it matters more how you use it than how much you have. Reality is if you don't have it, you can't use it. And those who have more flexibility in how they use it than those who have less. The Moneyball thing kind of falls apart in so many ways. Cuts usually hit low income and minority students first and worse, and it costs more to achieve higher outcomes than lower ones. If I can, get policymakers to just ingrain that in their thinking, I will have accomplished maybe something. Race is the underlying cause, not just some incidental correlate of many of the disparities in school funding, if not most. I mean, so much of this is built on racial disparity. A major stepped up federal effort is going to be required to really achieve a nationally equitable system. And that's also going to require some redesign of the way federal aid is allocated and some regulation. We got to have some federal butt kicking on the states that have thrown their education systems under the bus. And problems created on the basis of race require solutions explicitly based on race. New faculty, grad students, researchers, go at this school finance stuff. And by the way, we're all approachable. This is a fun crowd. You should have seen everyone at the bar last night. Talk about this, or ask questions, ask for data. I got a pile of data sitting around that I don't have the time to mess with. So if you want to use it, hey, drop me an email. I'll even give you a card. Oh, gee, I didn't bring them down, but with my personal email so you can get to me quicker. Equitable and adequate school funding undergirds nearly every aspect of everything that we do. And at the very least, it's a backdrop feature, a covariate in the things that we need to look at. But you can also put it in the forefront. We need more people, and we need a more diverse professoriate studying school finance. I want to see, in particular, knowing these persistent issues facing Latinx communities, whether they are ag communities like Dodge City and in Garden City, Kansas, or Lexington, Nebraska, or whether they are older kind of Mill Valley, predominantly Puerto Rican communities in the Northeast, like Waterbury, Connecticut, or Holyoke, Massachusetts. Latino districts are really getting screwed, and we need some strong Latino voices in the professoriate attacking these issues. So I encourage that. We need diversification in the voices that are doing school finance. It's getting better, but it's not where it needs to be. Use your research to inform policy and policy makers. A couple of last points. Don't be obtuse in describing your findings. Put it right out there. Be blunt when the finding warrants being blunt. Last thing, for anyone who deals with this in policy circles and gets pushed back on this whole causation versus correlation. Statistical causation and real world causation are two very different things. And legal causation, proving a case in court, is around this real world causation point. It may not be that I can establish a statistically causal model that will make it into an econ journal between those HOLC redlining maps and the funding gaps, but I can certainly establish a clear historical causal story that proves real world causation. And we need to really start hammering that home. And I think that brings me to the end. I probably went a few minutes over because I tend to, but thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, for that wonderful and informative lecture. We have a few minutes before we transition to our next session. So I want to open it up for questions and comments and ideas from you all. So I see a question in the back. I have a mic. I'll throw it at you.
Bruce, wonderful lecture. Thank you so much for all the information. I'm over to your left. So thank you for all the shout outs as well. We appreciate your work as young school finance scholars. Obviously, you're one of the individuals I think that we look up to for making lanes in this space and really like showing us and highlighting where we should be putting our attention for the future, right? So in talking about the future, you tend to have a bit of a crystal ball, which is a conversation that we young school finance scholars have had recently. And in your crystal ball, I am wondering, we know that the impact of the recession was deep and steep and continuous. We're all wearing masks. Most of us are wearing masks in this room, and there's been quite a bit of fiscal insolvency in states. There's been a ton of austerity measures. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you see for the next 36 to 60 to 72 months for the school finance profiles of our districts, especially with regards to Black districts, Indigenous districts, and Latinx districts? Thank you so much.
Well, I think two important positive notes are that, one, I think we're starting even among policymakers, starting to have more open conversations about racial disparities and racist causes. And two, I think partly kind of on the heel, because we have stepped up federal support as pandemic response for schools, we're starting to see a bigger conversation around how can we keep up an elevated level of federal support following this kind of COVID period. So there is a conversation. Now, of course, it's hard, obviously, to get stuff through Congress that involves dramatic increases in federal spending. There are at least two significant barriers to that. And we all know the names, to increasing the federal, but there's at least a conversation about doubling or tripling federal money. And even if driven through the Title I formula as it is, the vast majority of that money would go to districts with higher poverty rates, and it would largely also hit many of these districts that are predominantly Black or predominantly Latino. It would not perfectly, and that's why we need to talk more about design. But we also need to recognize, and I don't know how we get there, we need to recognize that the federal government has to play a stepped up regulatory role, a stepped up role in putting pressure on states to put back up their own effort. Most school funding still comes from state and local sources. Some states have simply decided to not bother anymore, or even aggressively decided to kind of more crush their public education systems. It's almost like we need a new and better reconstruction period of strong federal intervention to pressure, is the softest term I can come up with, those states into doing the right thing. Incentivizing them with dramatic increases in federal aid might not get them there. Although even, we look at like Medicaid expansion and stuff like that, you might get some red states there with that. But yeah, it's hard. I don't see Arizona, Tennessee. Well, Tennessee is talking about turning themselves around, but it might be a little bit of a shell game. They're talking about it as a way to get a settlement on a court case. But I don't see these states turning themselves around on their own and reinvesting in schools, especially the states where there's not even a threat of judicial intervention. So it's going to take some strong federal intervention and some dramatic increases in federal money if we can ever accomplish that. I hope that gets us somewhere in the conversation, but we're talking about these things now, which is nice.
Thank you. We have more questions.
Bruce, good morning. I appreciate your work. I used to use your book at Howard University to really push for equity. From those conversations grew the idea of not just measuring adequacy, but college readiness, right? So now we're raising the bar, which is now part of the federal conversation in ESSA. So now I'm at the wonderful, intentionally underfunded state of Arizona and trying to see how do we shift from adequacy over to college readiness, where you're talking about this is how you get to college. And it's moving away from adequacy to the college. And I'm glad you used the educational opportunity, but if we're talking about where the highest and best have access to succeed, and then tying school funding, how do we push that conversation?
Well, that it's by the same model, but setting that as the bar. right? That the goal, and again, adequacy is kind of like, it's a dirty word in this. I mean, maybe adequacy is that every kid has equal opportunity to be college ready. And in fact, that's implicit in a lot of state standards. When states establish college readiness standards and then establish metrics to track the pathway to college readiness, that becomes the implicit standard that the cost models need to be built on. So we did that for the state of New Hampshire. Actually, recently, we used the college readiness standards as the basis for estimating the costs of equal opportunity to be college ready. But we also need to really enrich our measures of college readiness beyond just tests of reading and math that are supposedly predictive of getting a certain score on the SAT or ACT, which is then supposedly predictive of getting beyond remedial placement in math in the first 2 years of college. The other thing that we're actually also doing is applying these same cost modeling methods to public to community college systems now, to figure out how to more equitably distribute aid to community colleges to ensure comparable success rates among students from different backgrounds choosing different career paths. So we can really build on this whole idea along the way. But yeah, we gotta set high goals. You saw how much, like, the Massachusetts outcome goal might be closer to that, getting everyone college ready. And they're the whole map, except for Massachusetts, New Jersey, and some of the whole map was red, and a lot of it deep red. The cost to get there are astronomical compared to even the costs of raising the bottom in our country to the current average. But we do have to be thinking about the higher standard, and we got to be thinking about how much more it's going to cost us to get there. And then we got to be willing to invest.
Bruce, thank you so much for the lecture. I think it was really, really powerful. But my question is, given like the clarity in your work and what you have presented today and what you have been presenting over the years, for example, this really great statement when you say it's going to be really difficult to impossible to get older white Americans to vote for schools in support of Black and brown students in an increasingly diverse system. So I'm just wondering, just the idea of pushing for that federal funding, which is still, currently less than 10 to 12% or whatever it is. How do we move into a space where we start to talk about challenging that local control paradigm, challenging this question of, will those people really vote against their interests if they're benefiting from the property tax, the state tax, the supplements? I mean, do we really expect them to say, oh, okay, now we're going to restructure our system to benefit those folks who we feel really don't have access, or if they're trying to move to a more privatized model? So I hope that's not too muddled, but I mean, I just wonder if still pushing this way, historically, your work seemed to say, we can still push up this hill, but are they really going to come forward and do something differently? And if they do, it seems like we're talking another 2, 3, 4 decades at least.
If we're lucky.
If we're
Yes. And these disparities and these issues operate at levels, right? From local to state to federal, right? Now, certainly, you know, if local communities, you know, if older white folks in local communities aren't willing to fund the schools of Black and brown kids in their local community, if there exists a state constitutional right that all kids should have equal opportunity to achieve some level of outcomes, whether affirmed by the courts or you know, but or at least in some language in the Constitution, if there's a state constitutional right, then local voters shouldn't have the authority to deprive the kids in their community of that state constitutional right. And that's where state school finance litigation comes in, right? That deference to local control, you know, if kids are bringing a case, I mean, these cases about equal opportunity and adequacy are brought on behalf of children. Sometimes taxpayers are involved in this, but it's not a taxpayer's right to pick and choose their tax rate in the Constitution. It's a child's right to have an equitable or adequate education. And the taxpayer choice, you know, that the local taxpayer shouldn't have the choice to deprive the kids of their community. And that should be affirmed by a state court and responded to by a state legislature. We don't have a federal constitutional right, but we could hopefully establish in better federal policy stepped up federal funding to distribute federal aid, you know, targeted to the right places, and a regulatory framework, which I'm still working on also with Preston and in kind of parallel with Center for American Progress, Ed Trust, and some other organizations to get states, because you have these states that have decided, well, we're just not going to fund the whole state system.
Mhm.
Well, they can kind of do that because we can't turn to them and say, states can't choose to deprive these kids of a federal right that doesn't exist in the Constitution. However, Derek Black has some nice stuff talking about, whether or not it is implicit in the requirements placed on states during Reconstruction, inclusion of education articles in their constitutions, whether there is an implicit federal kind of minimum adequacy right, which is also a door that's left open in Rodriguez and Plyler and a couple of other cases. So, but it's probably pretty low. It's like the Detroit case on literacy. So we need a federal right. It'd be awesome to have a U.S. constitutional amendment that speaks to an educational right toward high outcomes like college and career readiness, or however that evolves.
All right, thank you.
That was a little muddled answer, sorry.
Bruce, you continue to give us so much to think about. Can you all join me in thanking Bruce again for his lecture?
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That concludes our session for today. So hope have a good rest of the day.